The surface of the water broke with a soft splash, but below, something ancient and monstrous moved with lethal intent. A shadow darted beneath, and then the pain hit, a searing, tearing sensation that consumed every thought. Blood clouded the water, and the predator's sleek form became a silhouette of terror. The once friendly sea turned into a merciless battlefield. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start with today's shark attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. Click the like button, and let's get into the story. The roar of the small propeller plane's engines faded as it touched down on the airstrip in Gansby, South Africa. Jake Edwards, a 28-year-old adrenaline junkie from California, felt his heart race with anticipation. He'd been dreaming of this moment for years, the chance to come face to face with one of nature's most feared predators, the great white shark. As Jake stepped off the plane, the salty air hit his nostrils. He took a deep breath, savoring the moment. The coastal town of Gansby was quaint, nothing like the bustling beaches of his home state. But what it lacked in glamour, it more than made up for in its reputation as the great white shark capital of the world. Jake hefted his backpack and made his way to the small terminal building. A smiling woman holding a sign that read Apex Predator Diving caught his eye. "Jake Edwards?" she called out as he approached. "That's me," Jake replied with a grin. "Welcome to Gansby. I'm Sarah, one of the dive coordinators for Apex Predator. How was your flight?" Jake shrugged. "Long, but worth it. I've been looking forward to this for months." Sarah's smile wavered slightly. "Well, we're certainly excited to have you. But I do need to remind you, this isn't a theme park ride. These are wild animals in their natural habitat. Safety is our top priority." Jake nodded, trying to mask his irritation. He'd heard the safety spiel 100 times during his research. "I understand. I've done my homework." Sarah seemed to relax a bit. "Good to hear. Let's get you to the hotel. You'll meet the rest of the crew in the morning for a full briefing before we head out." The next morning dawned clear and calm. Perfect conditions for a dive, Jake thought as he made his way to the docks. The excitement that had been building for months was reaching a fever pitch. He spotted Sarah standing near a group of people by a sleek-looking boat. "Morning, Jake," Sarah called out. "Come meet the team." Jake joined the small gathering as Sarah made introductions. "This is Captain Mike. He'll be steering us out to the dive site. Next to him is Dr. Emily Chen, our marine biologist. And this strapping lad," she said, gesturing to a muscular man with sun-weathered skin, "is Tom, our lead dive master." Tom fixed Jake with an intense stare. "First time cage diving?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, but I've got over 100 dives under my belt. I'm certified for—" Tom cut him off. "Doesn't matter. This isn't like any other dive you've done. These aren't pretty little reef fish we're dealing with. These are apex predators, and they demand respect. You follow my instructions to the letter. Got it?" Jake bristled at Tom's tone but nodded. "Crystal clear." Dr. Chen stepped in, her voice calm and measured. "Why don't we all board? I can give you some background on the sharks we might encounter during the trip out." As the boat cut through the waves, Dr. Chen explained the local great white population. "We're in a unique location here," she said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "The channel between Dyer Island and Geyser Rock creates a perfect hunting ground for great whites. They come here to feed on the Cape Fur seal colony." Jake leaned forward, genuinely interested. "How big do they get?" "The females can grow up to 20 feet long and weigh over 4,000 pounds. Dr. Chen replied. "Males are generally smaller, maxing out around 13 to 15 feet. But size isn't everything. Even a small great white is a formidable predator." "What about attacks on humans?" Jake asked. "I mean, that's what everyone worries about, right?" Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. "Attacks on humans are actually quite rare. Great whites don't actively hunt humans. When attacks do occur, it's usually a case of mistaken identity. They're much more likely to mistake a surfer or swimmer for a seal than to view a diver as prey." Jake nodded, feeling a mix of relief and, was it disappointment? The rational part of his brain knew he shouldn't want a close encounter, but the thrill-seeker in him couldn't help but hope for some excitement. Captain Mike's voice crackled over the boat's speakers. "We're approaching the dive site. Crew, Prepare for anchoring. Tom stood up, his face stern. All right, listen up. We're going to go over the safety procedures one more time. Jake, pay close attention. For the next 15 minutes, Tom drilled Jake on every aspect of the dive, from proper cage entry and exit to emergency protocols. Jake found his irritation at Tom's gruff manner fading as he realized just how seriously the crew took safety. As Tom finished his briefing, Sarah approached with a wetsuit. Time to suit up, Jake. How are you feeling? Jake took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he took the wetsuit. Excited. Nervous. Is that normal? Sarah smiled kindly. Completely normal. Just remember, you're here to observe. The sharks aren't interested in you. They're wild animals, not monsters. Jake nodded, swallowing hard as he began to put on the wetsuit. The neoprene felt tight and constricting, adding to his growing nerves. He watched as the crew lowered the steel cage into the water, the reality of what he was about to do finally sinking in. Tom approached, holding out a diving mask. Last chance to back out, he said, his voice softer than before. No shame in it if you're not feeling up to it. Jake shook his head firmly. No way. I didn't come all this way to chicken out now. Tom nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. All right then, mask on and follow me to the cage. Jake's heart pounded as he climbed down the ladder on the side of the boat. The water was colder than he expected, sending a shock through his system despite the wetsuit. He paused at the water's surface, taking a few deep breaths through his mask. Remember, Tom's voice came from above. Slow, steady movements. No splashing. Enter the cage feet first and hold on to the bars at all times. Jake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He lowered himself into the cage, the steel bars simultaneously reassuring and claustrophobic. As the water closed over his head, the muffled silence of the underwater world enveloped him. For a moment, all Jake could see was the murky green-blue of the open ocean. Then movement caught his eye. A sleek gray shape glided past the cage just at the edge of visibility. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This was it. He was in the domain of the great white shark. The shape disappeared into the gloom, leaving Jake with a mix of awe and trepidation. He gripped the bars of the cage tighter, his knuckles white beneath his diving gloves. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Suddenly, a much larger shape loomed out of the darkness. Jake's eyes widened as a massive great white shark, easily 15 feet long, swam directly towards the cage. Its black eye seemed to fix on Jake, emotionless yet somehow intelligent. As the shark passed within inches of the cage, Jake could see every detail. The rows of serrated teeth visible behind its slightly open jaws, the scars that crisscrossed its rough skin, the powerful muscles rippling beneath its streamlined body. In that moment, Jake understood. This wasn't just a thrill ride. He was in the presence of a perfect predator, honed by millions of years of evolution. The fear he felt was primal, a recognition of his place in the food chain. But mixed with the fear was something else, a profound respect for the creature before him, and a sense of privilege at being able to witness it in its natural habitat. As the shark disappeared back into the depths, Jake realized he was holding his breath. He forced himself to inhale, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. This was only the beginning. Jake settled into the cage, his nerves giving way to excitement. He was ready for whatever the ocean had in store for him next. Little did he know the true test of his courage was yet to come. The gentle rocking of the cage lulled Jake into a false sense of security. He had been in the water for nearly 30 minutes, and aside from that first breathtaking encounter, the sharks had kept their distance. The initial surge of adrenaline had faded, leaving him feeling almost disappointed. Suddenly, Tom's voice crackled through the underwater speaker system installed in the cage. Heads up, Jake. We're about to start chumming the water. Jake's pulse quickened. He knew that chumming, the practice of dumping fish parts and blood into the water, was controversial. Some argued it encouraged unnatural behavior in the sharks, but it was also the surest way to attract them to the cage. From above, Jake saw a dark cloud billowing into the water. The chum spread quickly, carried by the currents. He gripped the bars of the cage tighter, his eyes straining against the murky water. Minutes passed. Jake's muscles tensed with anticipation. Then, movement caught his eye. A sleek, gray shape glided into view, its movements smooth and deliberate. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the distinctive shape of a great white shark. This one was smaller than the behemoth he'd seen earlier, probably about 12 feet long. Despite its size, it moved with an effortless grace that belied its predatory nature. Jake watched, mesmerized, as the shark circled the cage, its black eye seeming to study him with cold curiosity. Female, about 12 feet, Dr. Chen's voice came through the speaker. Likely around 15 years old. Noticed the streamlined body shape and the powerful tail. Jake nodded, forgetting for a moment that the crew couldn't see him. The shark was beautiful in a primal way, its body perfectly adapted for its environment. As it passed close to the cage, Jake could see the rough texture of its skin dotted with small sensory pores called ampullae of Lorenzini. The shark completed another lazy circle around the cage, then suddenly darted towards a chunk of chum floating nearby. Jake flinched instinctively as the shark's jaws opened, revealing rows of serrated teeth. In a flash, the chum was gone, swallowed whole. "Did you see that?" Dr. Chen's excited voice came through again. "That's a classic ambush predator move. In the wild, they often attack seals from below, striking with incredible speed." Jake's heart raced. The power behind that casual movement was awe-inspiring and terrifying. He suddenly felt very small and very vulnerable, despite the steel bars surrounding him. More shapes appeared in the gloom. 2, then 3 more sharks joined the first, drawn by the scent of chum in the water. They ranged in size from about 10 feet to what Jake estimated was a 15-footer. The water around the cage was alive with motion as the sharks glided past, their movements precise and purposeful. "We've got a good showing today," Tom's gruff voice commented. "Remember, Jake, no sudden movements. Stay calm and enjoy the view." Easier said than done, Jake thought. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure the sharks could sense it. But he forced himself to take deep, steady breaths, focusing on the incredible scene before him. The sharks seemed to have settled into a pattern, circling the cage and occasionally darting after chunks of chum. Jake began to relax, marveling at their graceful movements. He even started to recognize individuals. The 12-foot female with a distinctive scar on her dorsal fin, a smaller male with a slightly crooked tail. Then, without warning, the atmosphere changed. The sharks' movements became more agitated, their circles tightening. Jake frowned, wondering what had caused the shift. "Hold on," Dr. Chen's voice came through, tinged with excitement. "We've got a new arrival, and he's a big one." Jake's eyes widened as a massive shape emerged from the murky depths. This shark dwarfed the others, its length easily surpassing 18 feet. Its girth was enormous, its jaws large enough to swallow a man whole. "Male, at least 18 feet, Dr. Chen reported. Possibly one of the largest great whites ever recorded in these waters. The other sharks gave the newcomer a wide berth, clearly recognizing his dominance. Jake watched awestruck as the massive shark approached the cage. Its eye, black and seemingly bottomless, fixed on Jake as it glided past. In that moment, Jake felt a primal fear unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This wasn't just a big fish, this was an apex predator, honed by millions of years of evolution into a perfect killing machine. And it was looking right at him. The giant shark circled the cage once, twice, each pass bringing it closer. Jake could see every detail of its rough skin, the scars that told of countless battles, the slightly open jaws revealing glimpses of razor-sharp teeth. "Jake," Tom's voice cut through his fear-induced trance. "I need you to stay calm. Don't make any sudden movements. We're going to start bringing the cage up slowly." Jake managed a small nod, his eyes never leaving the massive shark. As the cage began to rise, the water around him erupted into a frenzy of activity. The smaller sharks, sensing the end of the feeding opportunity, darted back and forth, snapping at the remaining chunks of chum. The giant male, however, remained focused on the cage. As it rose, the shark followed, its massive body undulating powerfully through the water. "Steady, Jake," Tom's voice came again, tension evident even through the tinny speaker. "We're almost there." The surface was just a few feet away when Jake felt it, a slight shudder running through the cage. He frowned, wondering if he had imagined it. Then it came again, stronger this time. A metallic groan echoed through the water. sending a chill down Jake's spine. "Tom?" he called out, forgetting for a moment that they couldn't hear him. "Something's wrong with the cage." The cage shuddered again, more violently this time. Jake grabbed the bars, his knuckles white beneath his diving gloves. The giant shark continued to circle, its passes becoming tighter, more aggressive. "We've got a problem." Tom's voice came through, the usual gruffness replaced by urgent professionalism. "Jake, listen carefully. We're going to get you out of there as quickly as we can, but I need you to stay absolutely still. Do not panic, do you understand?" Jake nodded, then remembered to give a thumbs-up signal. His heart was racing, every instinct screaming at him to get out of the water. The cage broke the surface, water cascading down the metal bars. Jake could hear shouts from the boat, see the crew rushing about. But his attention was fixed on the water around him. The massive dorsal fin of the giant shark cut through the surface, circling ever closer. The other sharks had disappeared, leaving Jake alone with this leviathan. "Jake," Sarah's voice tight with concern, "we're going to open the top of the cage. When I give the signal, I need you to swim to the boat as fast as you can. Understand?" Jake managed a shaky yes, his eyes never leaving the circling fin. The top of the cage creaked open. Jake tensed, ready to make his move. "Now, Jake," Sarah shouted. "Swim!" Jake launched himself out of the cage, his arms cutting through the water in powerful strokes. The boat seemed impossibly far away. He could hear the crew shouting encouragement, urging him on. Then a shadow fell over him. Jake looked up to see the massive form of the great white passing overhead, so close he could have reached out and touched it. Time seemed to slow as the shark's eye met his once again. In that moment, Jake understood something fundamental about nature, about life and death, about his own insignificance in the grand scheme of things. He was in the domain of a creature that had existed, virtually unchanged, for millions of years before humans ever walked the earth. The moment passed. Jake's hand grasped the ladder on the side of the boat. Strong arms hauled him aboard, voices asking if he was okay, if he was hurt. Jake collapsed on the deck, gasping for breath. His heart was pounding, his muscles shaking with adrenaline and exertion. But as he looked back at the water, at the dark shape gliding beneath the surface, he felt something unexpected. Gratitude, respect, awe. He had come face to face with one of nature's most perfect predators and lived to tell the tale. As the boat's engine roared to life, Jake knew that this experience had changed him forever. Little did he know, his encounter with the great white was far from over. The true test of his courage, and his will to survive, was yet to come. The boat's engine thrummed steadily as they made their way back to the dive site. Jake sat on the deck, his wetsuit still dripping, a mixture of excitement and apprehension churning in his stomach. The close encounter with the massive great white had shaken him, but the thrill of the experience had only intensified his desire for more. "You all right there, Jake?" Sarah approached, concern etched on her face. That was quite the welcome to Shark Alley. Jake managed a shaky smile. "Yeah, I'm good, just processing, I guess. That big guy was something else." Dr. Chen joined them, her eyes bright with scientific curiosity. "That was an exceptional specimen. We've been tracking him for years, but he's rarely come this close to the cages. You're very lucky, Jake." "Lucky?" Jake repeated, not entirely sure if that was the right word. "So, what now? Are we done for the day?" Tom's gruff voice cut in. "Not unless you want to be. We've got a second dive scheduled. If you're up for it." Jake hesitated. Part of him wanted nothing more than to stay on the boat safe and dry. But a larger part, the part that had driven him to come to Gansbai in the first place, was already itching to get back in the water. "I'm in," he said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. Tom nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Good man. We'll do a thorough check of the cage and equipment before we go back down. Safety first." As the crew bustled around, preparing for the second dive, Jake found himself drawn to the side of the boat. The water stretched out endlessly, deceptively calm. Somewhere beneath that glassy surface, the great whites were waiting. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Dr. Chen appeared beside him. Jake shook his head. "Just thinking about what's down there. I've always been fascinated by sharks, you know? But being in the water with them, it's something else entirely. Dr. Chen nodded. It's a perspective few people get to experience. These animals have been demonized in popular culture, but they're essential to the ocean ecosystem. They're not mindless killing machines. They're apex predators, perfectly adapted to their environment. Yeah, I get that now, Jake said softly. When that big one looked at me, I don't know. It felt like it was seeing right through me. Before Dr. Chen could respond, Tom's voice boomed across the deck. All right, people. Cage is checked and secure. Jake, you ready for round 2? Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself. Ready as I'll ever be. The process of entering the cage was familiar now, but no less nerve-wracking. As Jake lowered himself into the water, he felt the cold seep through his wetsuit, a sharp reminder of his vulnerability. Comms check. Tom's voice crackled through the underwater speaker. Jake, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Jake complied, his eyes already scanning the murky water around him. The cage felt solid, reassuring. He tried to push away the memory of the unsettling groans and shudders from the previous dive. All right, we're going to start chumming again, Tom informed him. Keep your eyes peeled. These predators can appear out of nowhere. Minutes ticked by. Jake's initial tension began to ebb, replaced by a growing sense of anticipation. Then movement caught his eye. A sleek form glided into view, its movements graceful and purposeful. We've got company. Dr. Chen's excited voice came through the speaker. Female, about 13 feet. Noticed the streamlined body shape. Jake watched, mesmerized as the shark circled the cage. This close he could see the subtle variations in color along its body, the small scars that told of a life spent in the unforgiving ocean. More sharks appeared, drawn by the scent of chum. Jake's initial fear gave way to awe as he observed their interactions. There was a clear hierarchy, with larger sharks asserting dominance over smaller ones. Fascinating, isn't it? Dr. Chen commented. We're observing behaviors that few people ever get to see in the wild. Jake was about to respond when he felt it, a slight vibration running through the cage. He frowned, wondering if he had imagined it. Then it came again, stronger this time. A metallic groan echoed through the water, sending a chill down Jake's spine. Tom, he called out instinctively, forgetting for a moment that they couldn't hear him. Something's wrong with the cage. The cage shuddered again, more violently this time. Jake grabbed the bars, his knuckles white beneath his diving gloves. The sharks, sensing the disturbance, began to circle more tightly, their movements becoming agitated. Jake, we're registering some unusual movement. Tom's voice came through, tense and professional. We're going to start bringing you up. Stay calm and hold on tight. The winch engaged and the cage began to rise, but something was wrong. Instead of a smooth ascent, the cage jerked and swayed alarmingly. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the water. The cage tilted sharply, nearly throwing Jake off balance. He clung to the bars, heart pounding as he realized what had happened. One of the cables had snapped. Mayday, mayday! Tom's voice crackled through the speaker, the usual gruffness replaced by urgent professionalism. We've got a cable failure. Jake, listen carefully. We're going to try to stabilize the cage. Whatever happens, do not leave the cage unless I explicitly tell you to. Do you understand? Jake managed a shaky thumbs up, his eyes darting between the circling sharks and the surface above. The cage swayed precariously, now hanging at an angle that left one side dangerously exposed. The sharks, agitated by the commotion, began to circle more aggressively. Jake's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he saw dorsal fins cutting through the water, drawing ever closer. Stay calm, Jake. Dr. Chen's voice came through, steady despite the situation. The sharks are curious, but they're not actively hunting. Your stillness is your best defense right now. Jake nodded, forcing himself to take deeper breaths. He could see the boat above, the crew rushing about in barely controlled chaos. The surface seemed impossibly far away. A flash of movement caught his eye. The large female shark they had first spotted was approaching the cage, drawn by the unusual activity. As it passed by the exposed side of the cage, its rough skin scraped against the metal bars. The contact seemed to trigger something in the shark. It circled back, this time bumping the cage more forcefully. The entire structure shuddered with the impact. "Tom!" Jake shouted, forgetting again that they couldn't hear him. "It's ramming the cage." As if in response, Tom's voice came through the speaker. "Jake, we see it. We're trying to scare it off, but the cage isn't stable enough to bring up quickly. I need you to move to the center of the cage, away from the sides. Can you do that?" Jake nodded, then remembered to give a thumbs up. Slowly, carefully, he began to inch towards the center of the tilted cage. Each movement felt agonizingly slow, the water resistance and his own terror making every motion a struggle. The shark circled back, its movements becoming more aggressive. Jake watched in horror as it opened its mouth, rows of serrated teeth gleaming in the murky water. It was going to attack again. Time seemed to slow as the shark charged. Jake pressed himself against the back of the cage, as far from the exposed side as he could get. The impact, when it came, was tremendous. The cage rocked violently, metal groaning in protest, and then with a sickening screech the weakened bars began to buckle. "Jake," Tom's voice urgent and commanding. "The cage is compromised. We're bringing you up now. Hold on tight and prepare for emergency extraction." The winch engaged again, the cage rising more quickly now. But the damage was done. Water rushed in through the bent bars, the shark's massive form thrashing just inches away from Jake. As the cage broke the surface, chaos erupted. Jake could hear shouting, see the crew rushing to secure the damaged structure. But his focus was entirely on the dark shape still circling below, waiting for another opportunity to strike. In that moment, as he clung to the bent bars of the cage, water lapping at his chest, Jake understood the true meaning of fear. He was no longer an observer, safely separated from the ocean's apex predators. He was prey, exposed and vulnerable in a world where he didn't belong. The true test of his survival instincts was about to begin. The world around Jake erupted into chaos as the damaged cage broke the surface. Shouts from the crew filled the air, mixing with the splash of waves and the grinding of metal against metal. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short. Panicked gasps. "Jake, hold on." Tom's voice cut through the din, authoritative and urgent. "We're securing the cage. Don't move." Jake clung to the bent bars, his knuckles white beneath his diving gloves. The cage swayed precariously, water sloshing around his chest. Through the gaps in the twisted metal, he could see dark shapes circling below, drawn by the commotion. Sarah's face appeared above him, her eyes wide with concern. "Jake, we're going to throw you a life ring. Can you reach it?" Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. He watched as Sarah hurled the bright orange ring towards him. It landed just short, bobbing tantalizingly out of reach. "I can't," Jake started to say, but his words were cut short by a violent jolt. The cage lurched sideways, nearly throwing him into the water. A collective gasp rose from the boat. "The cable's giving way," someone shouted. "We need to get him out now." Tom's face appeared next to Sarah's, his expression grim. "Jake, listen carefully. The cage isn't stable. We're going to count to 3 and then I need you to swim to the life ring as fast as you can. Understand?" Jake's throat went dry. Swim? In open water with great whites circling below? It was madness. But as the cage groaned and shifted again, he realized he had no choice. "Oh, okay," he managed to croak out. Tom nodded. "On my count, 1, 2, 3. Jake pushed off from the cage with all his might, his arms cutting through the water in powerful strokes. The life ring seemed impossibly far away. He could hear shouts of encouragement from the boat, but they were drowned out by the rushing of blood in his ears. Halfway to the ring, Jake felt something brush against his leg. He kicked harder, panic giving him an extra burst of speed. His hand closed around the rough texture of the life ring just as a dark shape rose from the depths beside him. "Pull!" Tom bellowed. "Pull him in now!" Jake felt the ring jerk as the crew began to haul him towards the boat. But the movement was agonizingly slow. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The massive great white they had spotted earlier was surging towards him, its dorsal fin cutting through the water like a knife. Jake could see its black eye, cold and predatory, fixed on him. "Faster!" Jake screamed, his legs kicking frantically. "It's coming!" The crew redoubled their efforts, hauling on the rope with all their might. Jake could see the boat getting closer, but the shark was gaining on him faster. Suddenly, he felt a sharp tug on his leg. Jake's scream was cut short as he was yanked underwater. The world became a swirling mass of bubbles and shadows. He thrashed wildly, his lungs burning for air. In the murky depths, Jake came face to face with the great white. Its mouth was open, rows of serrated teeth gleaming in the filtered sunlight. Time seemed to slow as Jake stared into the abyss of its throat, certain that his last moments had arrived. But survival instinct kicked in. With strength born of desperation, Jake lashed out, his fist connecting with the shark's sensitive snout. The creature recoiled, momentarily stunned by the unexpected attack. Jake seized the opportunity, kicking hard towards the surface. His head broke the water and he gulped in air greedily. The life ring was still within reach, and he grabbed it with both hands. "We've got him!" Sarah shouted. "Pull!" The crew hauled Jake aboard with frantic speed. He collapsed on the deck, coughing and gasping. But there was no time for relief. "It's coming back!" Dr. Chen's voice rang out in warning. Jake looked up in horror to see the great white's massive form launching itself partially out of the water, jaws snapping at the air where he had been moments before. The creature's size was even more terrifying out of the water, its scarred hide glistening in the sunlight. Tom was already in motion, grabbing a long pole topped with a metal hook. "Get back!" he shouted to the crew as he jabbed the pole towards the shark. The metal tip connected with the creature's gills, and it thrashed violently before sliding back into the water. For a moment, silence fell over the boat. Then, as if a spell had been broken, everyone burst into action. "Jake, are you hurt?" Sarah was at his side, her hands checking him for injuries. Jake tried to speak, but no words came out. He looked down at his leg, expecting to see it mangled or missing. To his amazement, it was intact, though his wetsuit was torn, revealing angry red scratches where the shark's teeth had grazed him. I'm okay," he finally managed to say, his voice shaky. "I think." Dr. Chen appeared with a first aid kit, her face pale but composed. "Let's get those scratches cleaned and bandaged. You're incredibly lucky, Jake. A few inches difference and..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jake knew how close he had come to becoming another statistic, another tragic headline. As Dr. Chen tended to his wounds, Jake's gaze was drawn back to the water. The great white was still there, its dorsal fin slicing through the waves as it circled the boat. It showed no signs of leaving. "Why is it still here?" Jake asked, unable to keep the tremor from his voice. Tom joined them, his expression grim. "It's been riled up by the encounter, and there's blood in the water now. Your blood. We need to get out of here fast." He turned to the captain. "Mike, start the engines. Let's get back to shore." As the boat's engines roared to life, Jake felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The adrenaline that had kept him going was starting to ebb, leaving him shaky and drained. Sarah wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "You're safe now, Jake. Try to rest. We'll be back on land soon." But as the boat began to move, cutting through the waves towards the distant shore, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this ordeal was far from over. He could still feel the ghost of the shark's touch on his leg, still see its cold, black eye staring into his soul. The great white had gotten a taste of him now, and something deep in Jake's gut told him that it wasn't done with him yet. As if to confirm his fears, a large dorsal fin appeared in the boat's wake, following them with relentless determination. The shark was escorting them back to shore, a silent promise that this encounter was just the beginning. Jake huddled under the blanket, his eyes fixed on that ominous fin. The thrill of adventure that had brought him to these waters had been replaced by a primal fear, a visceral understanding of his place in nature's grand design. He had come face to face with the ocean's apex predator and survived, but as the shore grew closer and the fin continued to shadow their progress, Jake knew that his true test of survival was yet to come. The first strike had been made. The great white had marked its prey, and Jake had a sinking feeling that their next encounter would be even more deadly. The boat's engine thrummed steadily as they made their way back to the dive site. Jake sat on the deck, his leg freshly bandaged, a mixture of fear and determination churning in his gut. The memory of the great white's attack was still vivid, but so was the allure of the ocean's most feared predator. "You sure about this, Jake?" Sarah asked, concern etching her features. "No one would blame you if you wanted to call it quits after what happened." Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I'm sure. I didn't come all this way to give up now. Besides, what are the odds of another close call like that?" Tom overheard and fixed Jake with a stern look. "Pretty damn high if you get complacent. This isn't Disneyland, kid. These are wild animals in their natural habitat. Respect that or you'll end up a shark chow." Jake nodded, chastened. "I understand. I'll be more careful this time." Dr. Chen joined them, her excitement barely contained. "The large male we encountered earlier is still in the area. This is an unprecedented opportunity to study its behavior up close." "Yeah, great," Jake muttered, unconsciously rubbing his bandaged leg. As they approached the dive site, the crew began preparations. The damaged cage had been replaced with a backup, its steel bars gleaming in the afternoon sun. Jake watched as they lowered it into the water, trying to quell the anxiety rising in his chest. Tom approached, holding out a diving mask. "Last chance to back out," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Jake shook his head, taking the mask. "I'm going in." As Jake lowered himself into the cage, the cold water sent a shiver through his body that had nothing to do with temperature. He gripped the bars tightly, scanning the murky depths around him. "Commencing chum release," Tom's voice crackled through the underwater speaker. "Keep your eyes peeled, Jake. They could come from any direction." Minutes ticked by, each second feeling like an eternity. Jake's muscles were tense, his senses hyper-alert. Then, movement caught his eye. A sleek form glided into view, its movements graceful yet menacing. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the great white that had attacked him earlier. Its size was even more impressive underwater, easily surpassing 18 feet. "Male, 18 feet, heavily scarred, Doctor." Chen's excited voice came through the speaker. "It's the same individual from earlier. Fascinating. He's displaying unusual persistence in staying near the boat." Jake watched, a mixture of awe and terror coursing through him as the shark circled the cage. Its black eyes seemed to fix on him, filled with cold intelligence. Suddenly, the shark changed course, charging directly at the cage. Jake barely had time to brace himself before impact. The cage shuddered violently, metal groaning under the assault. "What the hell?" Tom's voice, tight with tension. "Jake, are you all right?" Jake managed a shaky thumbs up, his heart pounding. The shark circled back, preparing for another run. "This isn't normal behavior," Dr. Chen's voice now laced with concern. "It's acting aggressively, almost purposefully." The shark struck again, this time focusing its attack on one corner of the cage. The impact was even stronger, and Jake heard an ominous creaking sound. "Tom!" he called out, forgetting they couldn't hear him. "Something's wrong with the cage." As if in response, Tom's voice came through, urgent and commanding. "We're bringing you up, Jake. The shark's behavior is too erratic. Hold on tight." The winch engaged, and the cage began to rise. But the great white wasn't done. It circled tightly, its massive body brushing against the bars. Each contact sent shudders through the structure. Halfway to the surface, disaster struck. With a sickening screech of metal, the weakened corner of the cage gave way. Water rushed in as the bars bent outward, creating an opening easily large enough for the shark to enter. "Mayday, mayday." Tom's voice frantic now. "The cage is breached. Jake, get to the opposite side now." Jake scrambled to obey, pressing himself against the far wall of the cage. But in the confined space, there was nowhere truly safe. He watched in horror as the great white circled once more, then aimed straight for the opening. Time seemed to slow as the shark's massive head pushed through the gap. Jake found himself face to face with rows of serrated teeth, each as long as his hand. The creature's black eye fixed on him, emotionless yet somehow triumphant. In that moment, Jake understood true terror. This wasn't just a predator seeking prey. This was nature in its rawest form, the culmination of millions of years of evolution focused on one thing: survival. With nowhere left to retreat, Jake did the only thing he could. He lashed out, driving his fist into the shark's sensitive gills. The creature recoiled, momentarily stunned by the unexpected attack. "Jake!" Sarah's voice tight with fear. "The cage is falling apart. You need to get out. Swim for the surface." Jake hesitated for a split second, years of diving safety training warring with the immediate threat. But as the shark recovered and began to push forward again, he made his decision. Taking a deep breath, Jake propelled himself through the gap in the cage, narrowly avoiding the shark's snapping jaws. He kicked hard, driving himself towards the surface, every instinct screaming at him to move faster. He broke the surface with a gasp, frantically searching for the boat. It was agonizingly far away, the crew's shouts barely audible over the pounding of blood in his ears. "Swim, Jake!" Tom bellowed. "Don't look back, just swim!" Jake struck out for the boat, his arms cutting through the water with desperate speed, but he could feel something rising beneath him. A presence so massive it seemed to displace the very ocean. A shadow fell over him. Jake looked up to see the great white breaching, its enormous body launching clear of the water. Time seemed to stand still as he met the shark's eye once more, man and predator suspended in a moment of primal connection. Then gravity took hold. The shark crashed back into the water mere feet from Jake, the impact sending him tumbling in a maelstrom of bubbles and churning water. Disoriented, Jake struggled to find the surface. His lungs burned, spots dancing before his eyes. Just as he thought he couldn't hold his breath any longer, his head broke the water. "Jake, over here!" He turned to see a life ring splashing down nearby. With the last reserves of his strength, Jake lunged for it, his fingers closing around the rough material just as he felt something brush against his leg. The crew hauled him in with frantic speed, strong hands grabbing him and pulling him aboard. Jake collapsed on the deck, coughing and gasping. "Get us out of here now," Tom shouted to the captain. As the boat's engines roared to life, Jake managed to lift his head. What he saw made his blood run cold. The great white was circling the boat, its dorsal fin slicing through the waves. It showed no signs of leaving, no indication that its hunt was over. Why is it still here?" Jake gasped out. Dr. Chen's face was pale, her scientific excitement replaced by grim understanding. "It's fixated on you, Jake. This isn't just predatory behavior anymore. It's personal." As the boat sped towards shore, the shark kept pace, a silent shadow in their wake. Jake huddled under a blanket, shivering not from cold but from the realization that his ordeal was far from over. He had survived the cage breach, escaped the jaws of death by mere inches. But the great white had marked him now, and Jake had a sinking feeling that their next encounter would be even more deadly. The battle for survival had only just begun. The boat's engine roared as it cut through the waves, racing back to the safety of Gansbai's harbor. Jake sat huddled on the deck, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes fixed on the horizon. But despite the distance they'd put between themselves and the dive site, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, hunted. "How you holding up, kid?" Tom's gruff voice broke through Jake's reverie. The older man sat down beside him, his weathered face etched with concern. Jake managed a weak smile. "Been better. Keep thinking I see that fin every time a wave breaks." Tom nodded, his eyes scanning the water. "That was a close call back there. Too close. In all my years doing this, I've never seen a great white behave like that." "What do you mean?" Jake asked, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with his wetsuit. Tom sighed, running a hand through his salt-crusted hair. "Great whites are apex predators, sure, but they're not mindless killing machines. They're curious, methodical. What that shark did, targeting you specifically, breaching the cage, it's not natural." Dr. Chen joined them, her tablet clutched tightly in her hands. "Tom's right. I've been reviewing the footage we captured, and the shark's behavior is unprecedented. It's as if it recognized you from the earlier encounter and, well, for lack of a better term, it seemed to hold a grudge." Jake's eyes widened. "That's impossible. Sharks don't have that kind of cognitive ability, do they?" Dr. Chen shook her head. "Not as we understand it, no. But there's still so much we don't know about these creatures. Their sensory capabilities, their memory. We're just scratching the surface of understanding." A heavy silence fell over the group, broken only by the steady thrum of the engine and the splash of waves against the hull. Jake's mind raced, replaying the terrifying moments in the cage. the shark's cold eye fixed on him with what he could only describe as malevolent intent. Sarah approached, carrying a steaming mug. "Here," she said, handing it to Jake. "It's hot cocoa. Might help with the shock." Jake took the mug gratefully, the warmth seeping into his trembling hands. "Thanks," he murmured. I don't know what to do now. I came here for the adventure of a lifetime, but this... No one would blame you if you wanted to call it quits," Sarah said gently. "What you've been through, it's more than most people experience in a lifetime of diving." Jake nodded, taking a sip of the cocoa. The sweet warmth helped ground him, clearing some of the fog from his mind. "I know I should be terrified, and I am. But there's a part of me that I don't know. It's like I've seen behind the curtain, you know? Experienced something so primal, so raw." Tom's eyebrows shot up. "You're not thinking of going back in, are you? After what just happened?" Jake shook his head. No, I'm not suicidal. But I can't just walk away either. Not without understanding." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her eyes bright with a mixture of concern and scientific curiosity. "What do you mean, Jake?" Jake set down the mug, his hand steadier now. "That shark, the big male, it's still out there, and for whatever reason it's fixated on me. I can't just ignore that. I need to know why. What makes this one different?" The others exchanged worried glances. Tom opened his mouth to speak but was cut off by a shout from the captain. "Land ho! Gansbai Harbor, dead ahead." The tension on the boat eased slightly as the shoreline came into view. Jake felt a mixture of relief and... was it disappointment? The thought surprised him, and he pushed it away, focusing instead on the approaching harbor. As they neared the dock, Jake noticed a small crowd gathering. News of the incident must have spread quickly. He could see camera flashes, hear the murmur of excited voices. "Vultures," Tom muttered, "ready to make a spectacle of other people's misfortune. We'll handle them," Sarah assured Jake. "You just focus on getting some rest. You've been through enough today." The boat docked with a gentle thud. Jake stood on shaky legs, the events of the day catching up with him all at once. As he made his way to the gangplank supported by Sarah and Tom, a barrage of questions hit him. "Mr. Edwards, can you tell us what happened out there? Is it true you were attacked by a great white shark? Will this incident affect the local cage diving industry?" Jake blinked, overwhelmed by the onslaught. But before he could respond, the authoritative voice cut through the chaos. "That's enough. This man needs medical attention and rest. Any questions can be directed to our PR department tomorrow." Jake looked up to see a tall, distinguished-looking man in a crisp uniform pushing through the crowd. He approached Jake, his face a mixture of concern and relief. "Mr. Edwards, I'm Harbor Master Johnson. We've been informed of your ordeal. There's an ambulance waiting to take you to the hospital for a thorough checkup." Jake nodded gratefully, allowing himself to be led through the crowd. As they reached the ambulance, he turned back to look at the boat. For a moment he thought he saw a dark shape in the water beyond the harbor mouth, a fin cutting through the waves. But then it was gone, leaving Jake to wonder if it had been real or just a product of his frayed nerves. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Jake answered questions from paramedics on autopilot, his mind still out on the water, still locked in that primal moment of eye contact with the great white. Hours later, after being poked, prodded, and declared miraculously unharmed save for some minor abrasions, Jake found himself alone in a quiet hospital room. The adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving him exhausted but oddly alert. A soft knock at the door roused him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called out. Dr. Chen entered, carrying a laptop. "How are you feeling, Jake?" He shrugged. "Physically? Fine, surprisingly. Mentally? I'm not sure yet." Dr. Chen nodded sympathetically. "That's to be expected. What you went through, it's not something many people experience and live to tell about." She hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I hope you don't mind, but I've been reviewing the footage we captured today. There's something I think you should see." Jake sat up straighter, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. "What is it?" Dr. Chen opened her laptop and turned it so Jake could see the screen. "This is from just before the cage breach," she explained, hitting play. Jake watched as the massive great white circled the cage on the screen. Its movements were deliberate, calculated, As it approached the corner that would eventually give way, Jake noticed something he hadn't in the heat of the moment. "Its eye," he murmured. "It's different." Dr. Chen nodded excitedly. "Exactly. Watch how it rotates its eye as it approaches the cage. It's not just looking at you. It's analyzing, assessing the structure of the cage." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "That's not normal behavior, is it?" "Not even close," Dr. Chen confirmed. "Great whites are intelligent, but this level of problem solving, it's unprecedented." Jake leaned back, his mind reeling. "So what does this mean? Is this shark some kind of, I don't know, super shark?" Dr. Chen shook her head. "I don't think so. At least, not in the way you mean. But it's definitely unique. Its size, its behavior. This could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study great white cognition and problem-solving abilities." Jake caught the gleam in her eye. "You want to go back out there, don't you? To find it again?" Dr. Chen had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "From a scientific standpoint, the potential knowledge we could gain is immeasurable. But," she added quickly, "I understand if you want nothing more to do with this. No one would blame you." Jake was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the paused image of the great white on the screen. Its eyes seemed to stare back at him, challenging him. Finally, he spoke. "If we do this, if we go back out there, what's the plan?" "I'm not getting back in that cage. Not with that thing out there." Dr. Chen's eyes widened. "You're considering it, Jake? Are you sure?" Jake nodded slowly. "I can't explain it, but I feel like this isn't over. That shark, it's still out there. And for whatever reason it's fixated on me. I need to understand why." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her excitement barely contained. "We could use a larger boat, reinforce the observation deck. No cages this time, just surface observation and underwater cameras. We could track its movements, study its behavior patterns." As Dr. Chen outlined her plans, Jake felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation building in his chest. He knew it was crazy, knew he should be on the first plane home after what he'd been through, but something deeper, more primal, kept him rooted to the spot. He had looked into the eyes of nature's perfect predator and lived to tell the tale, but the encounter had changed him, awakened something he didn't fully understand. As he listened to Dr. Chen's enthusiastic planning, Jake knew he was committing to something dangerous, possibly deadly, but he also knew he had no choice. The great white had marked him, chosen him for reasons he couldn't fathom, and Jake was determined to see this through, to understand the creature that had nearly ended his life. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the hospital room window, Jake made his decision. "All right," he said, interrupting Dr. Chen's excited monologue. "Let's do it. Let's find this shark." Dr. Chen's face lit up, but Jake held up a hand. "But we do this smart. No unnecessary risks, and at the first sign of real danger, we abort. Deal?" Dr. Chen nodded solemnly. "Deal. We'll start making preparations right away." As she left the room, already typing furiously on her phone, Jake turned to look out the window. Somewhere out there, beyond the peaceful harbor, the great white was waiting. And Jake knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that their next encounter would be even more intense, even more primal. The battle for survival and understanding was far from over. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Jake found himself back at Gansbai Harbor. The early morning mist clung to the water's surface, giving the scene an ethereal quality that belied the danger Jake knew lurked beneath the waves. "You sure about this, kid?" Tom's gruff voice broke through Jake's contemplation. The older man was loading equipment onto a significantly larger boat than they'd used for the cage diving. Jake nodded, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "As sure as I'll ever be, we need to understand what's going on with this shark." Dr. Chen approached, her arms full of high-tech camera equipment. "The boat's rigged with underwater cameras and sonar. We should be able to track our friend without putting anyone in the water." "Friend is a bit of a stretch, don't you think?" Sarah chimed in, joining the group. Her face was etched with concern. "Jake, it's not too late to back out. No one would think less of you." Jake appreciated her concern, but he'd made up his mind. "I can't explain it, Sarah. But I need to see this through. That shark, There's something different about it. I need to understand why. Sarah nodded reluctantly. Just promise me you'll be careful. No heroics, okay? Scout's honor, Jake replied with a weak smile. As they finished loading the boat, Harbor Master Johnson approached. Mr. Edwards, Dr. Chen, I hope you understand the risks you're taking. If anything goes wrong out there, Dr. Chen stepped forward. We appreciate your concern, Harbor Master, but this is a unique opportunity to study great white behavior. The potential scientific value is immeasurable. Johnson didn't look convinced, but he nodded. Very well, but I want hourly radio check-ins, and at the first sign of trouble, you turn that boat around. Understood? Understood, Jake and Dr. Chen replied in unison. As they cast off, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. The last time he'd left this harbor, he'd been full of excitement and anticipation. Now, a mix of fear and determination coursed through his veins. The larger boat cut through the waves with ease, quickly leaving the safety of the harbor behind. Jake stood at the rail, his eyes scanning the water. Every whitecap, every shadow beneath the surface sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. Approaching the previous encounter site, Tom called out from the wheelhouse. Dr. Chen, you want to start your observations? Dr. Chen nodded, already peering intently at a bank of monitors. Sonar's active. Underwater cameras are operational. Now we wait. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours ticked by with no sign of the massive great white. The initial tension began to give way to a sort of resigned boredom. Jake found himself almost wishing for some action, then immediately chastised himself for the thought. It was just past noon when Dr. Chen's excited voice broke the monotony. Movement, large object approaching from the southeast. Jake rushed to the monitors, his heart pounding. On the sonar screen, a massive shape was indeed moving towards their boat with purposeful speed. It's him, Jake breathed, recognizing the sheer size of the blip. It has to be. Tom's voice crackled over the intercom. All hands on deck. Secure any loose equipment. This could get rough. Jake moved to the rail, his eyes straining to catch a glimpse of the approaching predator. For a long moment, there was nothing but the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Then, without warning, the surface of the water erupted barely 20 feet from the boat. The great white breached, its enormous body launching clear of the water in a display of raw power that took Jake's breath away. Time seemed to slow as the shark hung suspended in the air. Jake found himself once again locked in that primal gaze. Man and predator caught in a moment of mutual recognition. Then gravity reasserted itself. The shark crashed back into the water, sending a spray of foam and seawater across the deck. Jake was drenched, but he barely noticed, his eyes fixed on the spot where the massive creature had disappeared. Did you see that? Dr. Chen's voice was filled with a mixture of awe and scientific excitement. The way it breached, it was showing off, demonstrating its power. Jake nodded numbly, still processing what he'd seen. The sheer size of the creature, up close and out of water, was staggering, but it was the intelligence in that cold, black eye that truly shook him. Where is it now? Sarah called out, her voice tight with tension. For a moment, there was no response. Then Tom's urgent voice came over the intercom. Port side, it's coming around for another pass. Jake spun, his eyes scanning the water to their left. He caught a glimpse of a massive dorsal fin cutting through the waves, heading straight for the boat. Brace for impact, Tom shouted. The collision, when it came, was jarring. The entire boat shuddered as the great white rammed its side. Jake was nearly thrown off his feet, grabbing the rail at the last second to steady himself. Is everyone okay? Sarah called out, her voice shaky but professional. A chorus of affirmatives rang out, but Jake barely heard them. His attention was fixed on the water, watching as the shark circled back for another pass. This isn't normal behavior, Dr. Chen said, her earlier excitement replaced by concern. It's acting aggressively, purposefully, almost like it's testing our defenses. Jake felt a chill run down his spine at her words. The memory of the cage breach flashed through his mind. We need to get out of here, he said, his voice low but urgent. Now. Tom didn't need to be told twice. The boat's engines roared to life, and they began to move away from the attack site. But the great white wasn't done with them yet. "It's following us," Sarah shouted, pointing at the massive fin cutting through their wake. Jake watched in a mixture of awe and terror as the shark kept pace with the boat, its powerful tail propelling it through the water with seemingly effortless speed. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Chen muttered, her eyes glued to the monitors. "The sustained speed, the focused pursuit. It's rewriting everything we thought we knew about great white behavior." Jake barely heard her. His mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't just a hunt. It felt personal, targeted. But how could that be? Sharks weren't capable of that kind of focused intent, were they? The chase continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The shark showed no signs of tiring, matching every turn and burst of speed from the boat. Suddenly, Tom's voice cut through the tension. "Hold on, we've got a problem." Jake looked up to see Tom emerge from the wheelhouse, his face grim. "Engine's overheating. We need to cut speed or risk burning it out completely." Dr. Chen's eyes widened. "But if we slow down..." "The shark catches up," Jake finished, his voice hollow. A heavy silence fell over the boat as the implications sank in. They were miles from shore, being pursued by a creature that seemed hell-bent on their destruction. And now, their only means of escape was failing them. Jake's mind raced, searching for a solution. Then a crazy idea struck him. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it might be their only chance. "Tom," he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "How close are we to Dyer Island?" Tom frowned, checking their position. "About 2 miles east." "Why?" Jake took a deep breath. "The seal colony. If we can make it there..." Understanding dawned on Dr. Chen's face. "The shark might be distracted by its natural prey." "Jake, that's brilliant. And incredibly risky," Sarah cut in. "We'd be putting ourselves right in the middle of great white feeding grounds." Jake nodded grimly. "I know, but it might be our only shot. We can't outrun this thing forever." Tom considered for a moment, then nodded. "All right, hold on tight, everyone. This is going to be a bumpy ride." The boat veered sharply to the east, its engines straining as Tom pushed them to their limit. The great white followed, its massive form a constant presence in their wake. As they approached Dyer Island, Jake could hear the barking of seals over the roar of the engines. The water around them began to churn with activity as they entered the heart of the feeding grounds. "There!" Sarah shouted, pointing to a gap between 2 rocky outcroppings. "We can anchor there." Tom guided the boat into the narrow channel, cutting the engines as soon as they were clear. For a moment, the only sounds were the lapping of waves against the hull and the distant calls of seals. "Where is it?" Jake asked, his eyes scanning the water. "Did we lose it?" As if in answer, a massive form breached the surface just yards from the boat. The great white hung in the air for a moment, its jaws open wide, before crashing back down into a group of fleeing seals. The water erupted into chaos. Seals scattered in every direction, their panicked barks filling the air. The shark moved with incredible speed and precision, its massive body twisting and turning as it pursued its prey. Jake watched in awe as nature's most perfect predator demonstrated why it had ruled the oceans for millions of years. The raw power, the fluid grace, the ruthless efficiency. It was terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. For nearly an hour, they watched as the great white hunted. It showed no signs of tiring, no loss of focus, but neither did it approach their boat again. As the frenzy of activity began to die down, Dr. Chen turned to Jake, her eyes wide with excitement and a hint of fear. "Do you realize what we've just witnessed? This level of sustained hunting, the problem-solving intelligence it displayed in pursuing us, it's revolutionary." Jake nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the water where the shark had last disappeared. "It's amazing," he agreed, "but it's also terrifying. That thing, it's not just a normal great white, is it?" Dr. Chen shook her head. "No, I don't think it is. This shark, it's something special, something unique, and for whatever reason, it's fixated on you, Jake." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Jake knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him that this was far from over. The great white was still out there, waiting, and sooner or later, they would meet again. As the boat slowly made its way back to Gansbai Harbor, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow in the water, every ripple on the surface seemed to hold the promise of that cold, intelligent eye. He had come face to face with nature's perfect predator and lived to tell the tale. But Jake knew that their next encounter would be even more intense, even more primal. The true test of survival and understanding was yet to come. And somewhere in the depths of the ocean, a massive great white shark continued its relentless patrol, waiting for the next round in this unprecedented battle of wills. The pre-dawn light cast a ghostly pallor over Gansby Harbor as Jake helped load equipment onto the research vessel. It had been 3 days since their harrowing encounter at Dyer Island, and the memory of the great white's relentless pursuit still sent chills down his spine. Yet here he was, preparing to venture out once more. "Last chance to back out, kid," Tom said gruffly, hefting a crate of scientific equipment onto the deck. "No one would blame you." Jake shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "I can't explain it, Tom, but I need to see this through. That shark, there's something about it, something I need to understand." Tom nodded, a mixture of respect and concern in his eyes. "Just remember, out there, you're not the apex predator. Don't let curiosity get you killed." As the sun began to peek over the horizon, Dr. Chen joined them on deck, her eyes bright with excitement despite the early hour. "We've got some new toys today," she announced, patting a sleek metal contraption. "Underwater drones with high-definition cameras. They'll let us get closer to our friend without putting anyone in harm's way." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Friend? That's a generous term for something that tried to eat me." Dr. Chen had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Force of habit. In my line of work, we try not to anthropomorphize or demonize the animals we study, even the ones that occasionally try to eat us." As they finished loading the last of the equipment, Harbor Master Johnson approached the dock, his face etched with concern. "Dr. Chen, Mr. Edwards, I hope you understand the gravity of what you're undertaking. That shark has already demonstrated behavior far outside the norm. If anything goes wrong out there—" "We understand the risks, Harbor Master," Dr. Chen assured him. "We've taken every precaution. No one will be entering the water and will maintain constant radio contact." Johnson didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded. "Very well. But at the first sign of trouble, I want you back in this harbor. Is that clear?" "Crystal," Jake replied, trying to project more confidence than he felt. As they cast off, Jake found himself at the rail scanning the water. The ocean stretched out before them, calm and innocuous in the early morning light. It was hard to believe that somewhere beneath that placid surface lurked a creature of such power and apparent intelligence. Hours passed with no sign of the great white. The initial tension began to give way to a sort of resigned boredom. Jake found himself almost wishing for some action, then immediately chastised himself for the thought. "Maybe it's moved on," Sarah suggested, joining Jake at the rail. "Great whites are known to travel vast distances. It could be halfway to Australia by now." Jake shook his head. "No, it's out there. I can feel it." As if summoned by his words, Dr. Chen's excited voice cut through the air. "Contact. Large object approaching from the southeast." Jake rushed to the bank of monitors, his heart pounding. On the sonar screen, a massive shape was indeed moving towards their boat with purposeful speed. "It's him," Jake breathed, recognizing the sheer size of the blip. "It has to be." Dr. Chen nodded, her fingers flying over a control panel. "Launching underwater drones now. Let's see if we can get a visual." The screens flickered to life, showing multiple views of the underwater world. For a moment there was nothing but empty blue. Then, a shadow passed in front of one of the cameras. "There," Sarah pointed, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and awe. The great white glided into view, its massive form filling the screen. Even through the camera lens, its presence was overwhelming. Jake found himself instinctively taking a step back from the monitor. "Magnificent," Dr. Chen murmured, her scientific detachment momentarily overcome by the sheer majesty of the creature before them. "Look at the scars along its flank. This shark has seen some serious battles." Jake nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen. The shark's body was indeed a roadmap of old wounds and fresh scratches, testament to a life spent as the ocean's apex predator. But it was the eye that captured Jake's attention. Even through the camera, he could sense the intelligence there, the focused intent. Suddenly, the shark turned, swimming directly at one of the drones. Its mouth opened, rows of serrated teeth gleaming in the filtered sunlight. "Evasive maneuvers," Dr. Chen called out, her fingers dancing over the controls. The drone darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the shark's powerful jaws. But the great white wasn't done. It circled back, its movements quick and precise. "It's hunting the drones," Sarah realized, her eyes wide. "But how? They don't look anything like its natural prey." Dr. Chen shook her head, her expression a mixture of scientific fascination and growing concern. "This level of problem-solving, of adaptability, it's unprecedented. It's as if it recognizes the drones as extensions of us, as threats to be eliminated." Jake watched as the shark systematically took out drone after drone, its attacks growing more precise with each pass. "It's learning," he said quietly, adapting its strategy in real time. As the last drone succumbed to the shark's relentless assault, a heavy silence fell over the boat. The implications of what they had just witnessed were staggering. Tom's voice broke through the tension. "We've seen enough. Time to head back," no one argued. As Tom turned the boat towards shore, Jake remained at the rail, his eyes scanning the water. The great white had disappeared after destroying the last drone, but Jake knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. They were about halfway back to the harbor when it happened. A massive form breached the surface barely 20 feet from the boat, water cascading off its scarred hide as it hung suspended in the air for a heart-stopping moment. Time seemed to slow as Jake found himself once again locked in that primal gaze. In that instant, he understood with terrifying clarity that this was more than just a hunt. It was a challenge, a test of wills between man and nature's most perfect predator. The shark crashed back into the water, the impact sending a spray of foam across the deck. Jake was drenched, but he barely noticed, his eyes fixed on the spot where the massive creature had disappeared. "Everyone okay?" Tom called out from the wheelhouse. A chorus of shaky affirmatives rang out, but Jake barely heard them. His attention was focused entirely on the water, watching for any sign of the shark's next move. He didn't have to wait long. The boat suddenly lurched violently, nearly throwing Jake off his feet. A sickening screech of metal on metal filled the air. "It's ramming us!" Sarah shouted, her voice tight with fear. Tom's urgent voice came over the intercom. "Engines damaged, we're taking on water." Jake's mind raced, adrenaline sharpening his senses. They were still miles from shore, being attacked by a creature that seemed hell-bent on their destruction. And now their only means of escape was failing them. Dr. Chen appeared at his side, her face pale but determined. "We need to send out a distress signal, but even if help comes, it'll take time we might not have." Jake nodded grimly. "So what do we do?" Before Dr. Chen could respond, the shark struck again. The impact was even more violent this time, sending equipment sliding across the deck. Jake heard the distinct sound of water rushing into the boat. "We're sinking," he realized, the words feeling surreal even as he said them. "We need to abandon ship." Tom's voice crackled over the intercom, confirming Jake's assessment. "Life rafts are our only option, but in these waters with that thing out there..." He didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew the danger they'd be facing in the inflatable rafts, but staying on the sinking boat wasn't an option. "Do it," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Deploy the rafts." The next few minutes were a blur of frantic activity. Jake helped Sarah and Dr. Chen into one of the life rafts while Tom worked to send out a final distress call. As Jake prepared to board the raft himself, a movement in the water caught his eye. The great white was circling, its dorsal fin slicing through the waves barely 10 feet from the sinking boat. Jake froze, one foot on the raft, his eyes locked on that ominous fin. In that moment, Jake made a decision that would change everything. "Go," he said to Sarah and Dr. Chen. "I'll draw it away." "Jake, no!" Sarah reached for him, but he was already moving back onto the deck of the sinking boat. "Are you insane?" Dr. Chen called out. "You can't stay here." Jake met her gaze, a strange calm settling over him. "That shark is fixated on me. Has been since the beginning. If I stay, You have a chance to get to safety." Before they could argue further, Jake grabbed a life vest and a long metal pole used for handling equipment. "Go!" he shouted. "I'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and they all knew it. But with the boat sinking rapidly and the shark circling ever closer, there was no time for debate. Tom joined Sarah and Dr. Chen in the raft, his face a mask of grim understanding as he met Jake's eyes one last time. As the raft drifted away from the sinking boat, Jake turned his attention to the water. The great white's fin had disappeared, but he knew it was still there, watching, waiting. "All right, you son of a bitch," Jake muttered, his hands tightening on the metal pole. "You want me? Come and get me." As if in answer to his challenge, the water erupted barely 5 feet from where Jake stood. The great white launched itself partially out of the water, its massive jaws snapping at the air where Jake had been a moment before. Jake stumbled back, his heart pounding. The sheer size of the creature up close and out of water was staggering, but it was the intelligence in that cold, black eye that truly shook him. As the shark slid back into the water, Jake knew he had only moments before it attacked again. He looked around frantically, searching for anything that might give him an advantage. His eyes fell on a canister of fuel that had come loose during the attack. Moving quickly, Jake grabbed the canister and unscrewed the cap. The sharp smell of gasoline filled the air. "Come on," he muttered, his eyes scanning the water. "Where are you?" The answer came in another violent impact that nearly knocked Jake off his feet. The shark was ramming the boat again, determined to send it to the bottom. Jake didn't hesitate. As the great white's massive form became visible just beneath the surface, he emptied the fuel canister into the water. The gasoline spread quickly, forming a slick on the surface. "Now or never," Jake said to himself, reaching into his pocket for the emergency flare he'd grabbed earlier. He struck it, the bright red flame casting an eerie glow in the pre-dawn light. Time seemed to slow as Jake watched the flare arc through the air. It hit the water with a soft hiss, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a whoosh, the surface of the ocean erupted into flames. The shark's reaction was immediate and violent. It thrashed in the burning water, its massive tail sending up sprays of flaming liquid. Jake watched in awe and terror as the creature that had haunted his nightmares writhed in apparent agony. But even as he felt a surge of triumph, Jake knew it wasn't over. The flames were already starting to die down, and the shark, while clearly injured, was far from defeated. As the last of the flames flickered out, Jake found himself once again face to face with the great white. Its skin was scorched in places, but its eyes, those cold, black eyes, were filled with what Jake could only describe as rage. In that moment, Jake understood with terrifying clarity that this was it. The final confrontation between man and nature's most perfect predator. And only one of them would be leaving these waters alive. The shark charged, its massive jaws open wide. Jake braced himself, the metal pole held out before him like a spear. As the great white's teeth closed around the pole, Jake felt himself being pulled into the water. The world became a swirling chaos of bubbles and shadows. Jake struggled to orient himself, his lungs burning for air. He could feel the shark's powerful body thrashing nearby, the water churning with its frenzied movements. In a desperate move, Jake kicked out, his foot connecting with something solid. The shark recoiled, momentarily stunned by the unexpected attack. Jake seized the opportunity, kicking hard for the surface. His head broke the water, and he gulped in air greedily. But there was no time for relief. He could see the shark's fin cutting through the water, circling back for another attack. Jake looked around frantically, searching for anything that might save him. His eyes fell on a piece of floating debris from the sunken boat. It wasn't much, but it was his only chance. He swam for it with all his might, his arms and legs burning with the effort. Behind him, he could hear the sound of the shark's approach, a rhythmic swish of water that grew louder with each passing second. Jake's hand closed around the debris just as he felt something brush against his leg. He pulled himself up, clinging to the makeshift raft with all his strength. The shark circled, its fin slicing through the water barely feet away. Jake could see the burns on its skin, angry red marks that stood out starkly against its gray hide. But the injuries seemed to have only fueled its rage. As Jake watched, The great white began to circle tighter, its movements becoming more agitated. He knew what was coming. The shark was preparing for its final attack. In that moment, as he clung to his tiny raft in the middle of the vast ocean, Jake felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had come face to face with nature's most perfect predator, had challenged it and survived longer than anyone could have expected. The shark's circle tightened further. Jake tensed, ready for the final confrontation. But just as the great white seemed poised to strike, a new sound cut through the air, the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades. Jake looked up to see a Coast Guard helicopter approaching rapidly. A spotlight beam cut through the pre-dawn gloom, illuminating the water around him. The shark, startled by the noise and light, broke off its attack. Jake watched in disbelief as its massive form slid beneath the waves, disappearing into the depths. As a rescue diver dropped into the water nearby, Jake felt a complex mix of emotions wash over him. Relief, certainly, but also a strange sense of disappointment. The confrontation had been building to this moment, this final test of wills between man and shark. And now, it would remain unresolved. As Jake was lifted to safety, he found his eyes drawn back to the water. Somewhere down there, the great white was nursing its wounds, perhaps planning its next move. Their battle was over for now. But Jake knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that this was far from the end. The shark was still out there, waiting. And someday, somehow, they would meet again. The true test of survival and understanding was yet to come. The rhythmic thump of the helicopter blades filled Jake's ears as he was lifted from the churning waters of the Atlantic. His body felt leaden, every muscle screaming in protest from the ordeal he'd just endured. As the rescue diver secured him to the winch, Jake's eyes remained fixed on the ocean below, searching for any sign of the massive predator that had nearly claimed his life. "Easy now, sir. We've got you." The diver's voice crackled through his headset. "You're safe. Safe." The word seemed almost foreign to Jake after the harrowing encounter with the great white. As they ascended towards the waiting helicopter, a mix of relief and an unexpected sense of loss washed over him. The confrontation with the shark had been building to a crescendo, a final test of wills between man and nature's perfect predator. And now, it had been left unresolved. The helicopter door slid open and strong hands pulled Jake inside. He collapsed onto the floor, his wet clothes immediately soaking the interior. A paramedic was at his side in an instant, checking his vitals and wrapping a thermal blanket around his shivering form. "Mr. Edwards? Can you hear me?" The paramedic's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you injured?" Jake managed a weak nod. I'm okay. The others, did you find them?" The paramedic's expression softened. "Your colleagues are safe. They were picked up by a Coast Guard vessel about an hour ago. They're the ones who alerted us to your position." Relief flooded through Jake. Sarah, Dr. Chen, Tom, they had made it. His sacrifice hadn't been in vain. As the helicopter banked towards the shore, Jake found his gaze drawn back to the vast expanse of the ocean. Somewhere down there, the great white was nursing its wounds, perhaps planning its next move. Their battle was over for now. But Jake knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him that this was far from the end. The flight back to Gansby seemed to pass in a blur. Before Jake knew it, they were touching down at a small medical center near the harbor. As he was helped onto a stretcher, he caught sight of a familiar face pushing through the gathering crowd. "Jake!" Dr. Chen's voice was thick with emotion as she reached his side. "My God, we thought, and when we saw the boat go down..." Jake managed a weak smile. "Takes more than a 20-foot shark to keep me down." Dr. Chen's relief gave way to scientific curiosity. "Jake, what you did out there, it was incredibly risky, but the data we gathered is unprecedented. The way the shark behaved, its problem-solving abilities, the focused aggression..." "Dr. Chen," a stern voice cut in. Jake looked up to see Harbor Master Johnson approaching, his face a mask of barely contained anger. "This is hardly the time or place for a scientific debrief." Johnson turned to Jake, his expression softening slightly. "Mr. Edwards, I'm glad to see you alive. But I hope you understand the gravity of what's happened here. Your reckless actions have not only endangered your own life, but potentially threatened the entire shark diving industry in Gansby. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but a wave of exhaustion washed over him. The adrenaline that had kept him going was finally wearing off, leaving him drained and disoriented. He needs rest, the paramedic interjected, already moving the stretcher towards the waiting ambulance. Any questions will have to wait. As Jake was loaded into the ambulance, he caught one last glimpse of the ocean on the horizon. The sun was rising, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. It was beautiful, peaceful, a stark contrast to the violent encounter he'd just survived. The next few days passed in a haze of medical examinations, police interviews, and media frenzy. Jake's encounter with the great white had made international news, sparking debates about shark behavior, ocean conservation, and the ethics of extreme tourism. It was on the third day of his hospital stay that Jake received an unexpected visitor. He looked up from the television, where yet another news segment about his miraculous survival was playing, to see a tall, distinguished-looking man enter his room. "Mr. Edward," the man said, his voice carrying a hint of an Australian accent. "I'm Dr. Malcolm Rhodes from the International Shark Research Institute. I was hoping we might have a chat about your experience." Jake sat up straighter, intrigued. "Of course. Dr. Rhodes, what would you like to know?" Rhodes pulled up a chair, his eyes gleaming with scientific curiosity. "Everything, Mr. Edwards. But let's start with the shark itself. In your own words, can you describe its behavior?" Jake closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the terrifying encounters. "It was different. Not just big, but smart. The way it attacked the boat, how it adapted its strategy. It felt almost personal." Rhodes nodded, scribbling notes. "Fascinating, and completely outside normal great white behavior patterns. Mr. Edwards, what you've encountered may be a genuine scientific anomaly." Jake leaned forward, wincing slightly at the pull of healing cuts and bruises. "What do you mean?" "Great whites are apex predators, certainly," Rhodes explained. "But the level of problem-solving and focused aggression you've described, it's unprecedented. This shark, if your observations are accurate, represents a significant leap in cognitive ability." A chill ran down Jake's spine as he remembered the cold intelligence in the shark's eyes. "So what does that mean? For the shark? For the ecosystem?" Rhodes's expression turned grave. "That's what we need to find out. Mr. Edwards, I'm here to offer you a unique opportunity. The International Shark Research Institute is putting together a team to study this particular shark. We want to track it, observe it, try to understand what makes it different, and we want you to be part of that team." Jake's heart raced at the prospect. Part of him wanted nothing more than to put this whole ordeal behind him, to return to the safety of his life in California. But a larger part, the part that had driven him to come to Gansby in the first place, was already itching to get back in the water. "It's still out there, isn't it?" Jake asked quietly. Rhodes nodded. "Satellite tracking has picked up a great white of unusual size moving along the coast. It's injured, but alive. And if it's the same shark you encountered, it's more dangerous now than ever." Jake took a deep breath, weighing his options. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to decline, to walk away while he still could. But the memory of that primal connection, that moment of silent communication between man and shark, pulled at him with an almost physical force. "When do we start?" Jake heard himself say. Jake heard, the words surprising even him. Rhodes smiled, a mix of approval and concern in his eyes. "As soon as you're medically cleared. But Mr. Edwards, I need you to understand the risks. This isn't a tourist expedition or a documentary shoot. We'll be actively seeking out and studying potentially the most dangerous shark ever encountered. Are you sure you're prepared for that?" Jake met Rhodes's gaze, a steely determination settling over him. "Doctor, I've looked into that shark's eyes. I've felt its power, its intelligence. If we don't understand what's happening here, more people will get hurt. I need to see this through." Rhodes nodded solemnly. "Very well. I'll make the necessary arrangements. Rest up, Mr. Edwards. You're going to need all your strength for what's coming." As Rhodes left the room, Jake turned his gaze to the window. In the distance, he could just make out the glint of sunlight on water. Somewhere out there, the great white was waiting. Their battle had been interrupted, but it was far from over. The true test of survival and understanding was yet to come. And this time, Jake would be ready. Chapter 10. Recovery and Reflection. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the beach as Jake Edwards made his way along the shoreline. His steps were slow, measured, each one a reminder of the ordeal he'd survived just weeks ago. The sound of crashing waves filled his ears, a constant rhythm that both soothed and unsettled him. It had been a month since his near-fatal encounter with the great white shark off the coast of Gansby. A month of physical therapy, psychological evaluations, and endless debriefings with marine biologists and shark experts. Now, finally cleared by his doctors, Jake found himself drawn back to the ocean. He paused at the water's edge, letting the cool surf wash over his feet. The sensation sent a shiver up his spine, a visceral memory of those terrifying moments in the open water. Jake closed his eyes, taking a deep breath of the salty air. "Didn't expect to see you back here so soon," a familiar voice called out. Jake turned to see Sarah approaching, her face a mixture of concern and relief. "Hey, Sarah." "Yeah, I needed to see it again. To face it, I guess." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "How are you holding up?" Jake shrugged, his gaze returning to the horizon. "Physically? Getting there. The nightmares are the worst part. I keep seeing those eyes, that mouth coming at me." He trailed off, lost in the memory. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm, grounding him in the present. "It's normal, you know," she said softly. "After what you went through, it'll take time to process. Have you considered talking to someone? A professional, I mean." Jake nodded. "The Research Institute set me up with a trauma specialist. It helps, but..." He gestured at the vast expanse of the ocean before them. "How do you explain this?" "The fear, sure. But also the pull. I can't stop thinking about it, Sarah." "About the shark." Sarah's brow furrowed with concern. "Jake, you don't owe anyone anything. You've done more than enough. No one would blame you if you wanted to walk away from all this." Jake turned to face her, a wry smile on his lips. "Would you? Walk away, I mean?" Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I suppose I wouldn't. But I'm not the one who nearly became shark food." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the waves roll in. Finally, Jake spoke again, his voice quiet but determined. "I'm going back out there, Sarah. Dr. Rhodes and his team. They're putting together an expedition to track and study the shark. They've asked me to be part of it." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Jake, are you sure that's wise? After everything that happened?" "I have to," Jake interrupted, his voice firm. "I can't explain it, but I feel connected to this somehow, like it's not finished. And if I don't see it through, I'll always wonder." Sarah studied his face, seeing the resolve in his eyes. She sighed, a mix of admiration and exasperation in her voice. "You're either the bravest or the craziest person I've ever met, Jake Edwards, probably both." Jake chuckled, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "Probably. But I can't just sit on the sidelines, Sarah, not when there's a chance to understand what's happening out there." As they continued their walk along the beach, Jake filled Sarah in on the details of the upcoming expedition. The International Shark Research Institute had spared no expense, outfitting a state-of-the-art research vessel with the latest in marine tracking technology. "They're calling it Operation Megalodon," Jake explained. "The plan is to track the shark's movements, study its behavior patterns, try to understand what makes it different from other great whites." Sarah nodded, her scientific curiosity piqued despite her concerns. "And what about safety measures? After what happened last time?" "Top-of-the-line security systems," Jake assured her. "Reinforced hull, shark cages made of advanced composites. We're not taking any chances this time." As they talked, Jake felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension building in his chest. The memory of those cold, intelligent eyes still haunted him, but now it was tinged with a burning curiosity. What made this shark different? What drove its seemingly focused aggression? Their walk brought them to a small beachside cafe. As they settled at a table overlooking the water, a news report on the cafe's television caught Jake's attention. "Another attack off the coast of Mozambique," the reporter was saying. Witnesses described the shark as unusually large and eerily intelligent. Experts are divided on whether this could be the same animal involved in the Gansby incident last month. Jake and Sarah exchanged worried glances. "It's on the move," Jake murmured, a chill running down his spine. "And it's still attacking boats." Sarah leaned in, her voice low and urgent. "Jake, this is getting serious. If it is the same shark, it's not just a local problem anymore. This thing could be a threat to coastal communities all along the African coastline." Jake nodded grimly. "All the more reason for this expedition to happen. We need to understand what we're dealing with." As they finished their coffee, Jake's phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Dr. Rhodes. "News from Mozambique. Expedition timeline moved up. Can you be ready in 48 hours? Jake looked up at Sarah, a mix of determination and nervous energy in his eyes. "It's happening. We leave in 2 days." Sarah reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "Promise me you'll be careful out there, Jake. This isn't just about scientific discovery anymore. It's about survival." Jake nodded, grateful for her concern. "I promise. We're going prepared this time. Whatever this shark is, whatever it wants, we'll be ready for it." As they left the cafe, Jake paused for one last look at the ocean. The sun was higher now, its rays glinting off the waves. Somewhere out there, the great white was waiting. Their interrupted battle would soon resume. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparations. Jake underwent final medical checks, reviewed safety protocols, and familiarized himself with the advanced equipment they'd be using on the expedition. On the morning of their departure, Jake found himself once again standing at the edge of Gansby Harbor. The research vessel, christened the Carcharodon after the scientific name for great white sharks, loomed before him. Its sleek lines and advanced sensor arrays spoke of the seriousness of their mission. Dr. Rhodes approached, clipboard in hand. "All set, Mr. Edwards? Last chance to back out." Jake shook his head, a wry smile on his lips. "Not a chance, Doctor. I need to see this through." As they boarded the vessel, Jake caught sight of a familiar face among the crew. Tom, the gruff dive master from his ill-fated cage diving experience, was helping to load equipment. "Didn't expect to see you here," Jake called out, surprised. Tom looked up, a hint of a smile breaking through his usually stern demeanor. "Could say the same about you, kid. Figured after what happened, you'd be on the first plane back to wherever you came from." Jake shrugged. "Couldn't leave the job unfinished. Besides, someone needs to keep you all out of trouble." Tom chuckled, clapping Jake on the shoulder. "Good to have you aboard. Just remember, out there, you're not the apex predator. Stay sharp." As the Carcharodon pulled away from the dock, Jake made his way to the bow. The open ocean stretched out before them, vast and mysterious. Somewhere beneath those waves, the great white was waiting. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the salt spray on his face. The memory of their last encounter flashed through his mind. The cold intelligence in the shark's eye, the raw power of its assault. But this time, the fear was tempered with determination. They were no longer predator and prey, but two intelligent beings on a collision course. As the coast of Gansby faded into the distance, Jake felt a sense of finality settle over him. This expedition would end one of two ways: with answers or with death. There would be no middle ground, no half measures. The true test of survival and understanding was about to begin. And this time, Jake Edwards was ready.